Otis Cravath had not slept in 3 days. He stood at the edge of his property in the gray light of January 14th, 1888, and looked across a valley that had just been beaten half to death. Snow to his thighs, ice on every surface that faced north, the kind of cold that did not feel like temperature anymore. It felt like intention. Behind him, inside the cabin, his wife sat by a fire that was barely alive. His son, Owen, 9 years old, had 2 fingers wrapped in cloth where the skin had gone white and stiff on the second night of the storm. 3 days ago, Otis had burned the last of his proper firewood. Then he burned the fence rails he had split in October. Then he burned the dining bench his father had built in Illinois in 1861 and carried to Montana on a wagon. He had fed that bench to the fire piece by piece, leg by leg, watching 60 years of family history turn to ash because there was nothing else left, and the temperature outside had not risen above 30 below zero in 72 hours. He was not a man who cried easily. He was 51 years old and had buried a child and survived a flood and watched 2 neighbors die of things that should not have killed grown men. But standing there in the snow on the morning the storm finally broke, Otis Cravath felt something close to shame, because he had done everything right. He had stacked his wood properly. He had chinked his cabin walls in September. He had rationed carefully. And still his son had frostbitten fingers, and his wife had not slept, and there was not a single piece of furniture left in the house that had not been evaluated as a potential fuel source. He looked across the valley toward the Braddock property. The barn out there was small, rough-sawn timber, shake roof, heavy with snow. Nothing unusual about it from a distance. But Otis had been watching that barn for 3 days in the way a man watches something that does not behave the way it should, because the chimney pipe on the north corner of that barn had been producing a thread of smoke so thin it barely registered. Not the thick rolling columns that poured from every other structure in the valley during a blizzard like this one. Not the desperate black smoke of a fire being fed everything combustible within reach. Just a thin, steady thread, barely more than a pipe left to cool. And the woodpile he could see, from where he stood, stacked along the south side of the barn, looked almost untouched. Otis pulled his coat tighter and started walking. He did not know exactly what he expected to find. He knew Carrie Braddock was a widow, 34 years old, with 2 daughters aged 12 and 7. He knew she had finished some kind of project in her barn over the summer, something people in the valley had opinions about, most of them unflattering. He knew that people had been talking about her the way people in isolated communities talk about someone who does things differently, with a mixture of concern and contempt that often sounds like one but is really the other. He had not given it much thought at the time. He had his own farm to run. But 3 days of burning his father's bench had a way of making a man reconsider what he had not given much thought to. He waded through the snow and knocked on the barn door. Inside, he could hear the soft sounds of animals, the low breath of cattle, the rustle of chickens settling. Then footsteps. Then the door opened. Carrie Braddock looked tired. Everyone looked tired after 3 days of that storm. But she did not look depleted. She did not look like a woman who had spent 72 hours fighting a losing battle against the cold. She looked like a woman who had been doing her regular work and was mildly surprised to have a visitor before breakfast. Otis took his hat off. He was not entirely sure what he was going to say, so he said the only honest thing available to him. "Your chimney barely smoked during the storm, Mrs. Braddock. Your woodpile looks like you didn't touch it. My family burned through 3 weeks of fuel in 3 days. We burned our dining bench. My youngest has frostbite on 2 fingers, even though we never let the fire die." He stopped. What he said next cost him something. "I need to ask you something. I need to understand what you did that we didn't." Carrie looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come see where we slept." She walked to the northwest corner of the barn and moved aside a stack of feed sacks. Underneath them was a trap door, heavy wood fitted flush with the barn floor. She lifted it, and warm air rose from below. Not hot, but unmistakably warmer than the barn itself, which was already warmer than the air outside. She descended a short ladder. Otis followed. The room below was small, 10 feet by 12, lit by a single oil lamp, and a narrow shaft of filtered light from what appeared to be a ground-level window, half buried in snow. The walls were stone limestone blocks fitted tight. The ceiling was a series of heavy timber beams 8 inches across notched into the stone. Between the beams were split planks, and above those the floor of the barn itself. The stove in the corner was cold, had been cold for hours, but the temperature in the room was nothing like the temperature outside. Otis pulled a small thermometer from his coat pocket, a habit from years of checking livestock through cold nights. He held it still. 58 degrees Fahrenheit, no active fire, 14 hours since the stove had last been lit. He looked at Carrie. How, he said, and Carrie told him. But that is not where the story begins. The story begins 11 months earlier, in February of 1887, on a morning so cold that the nails in the cabin walls were frosted, and a 7-year-old girl named Etta Braddock had been coughing for 6 weeks straight. Carrie had gone to the barn at 5 in the morning the way she went every morning, because the animals needed tending regardless of what the sky was doing. She stepped inside and stopped. It was warmer. Not warm, nothing in Montana in February was warm, but the barn was measurably noticeably less brutal than the air outside. The 2 milk cows breathed in small clouds. The mule stood with its eyes half closed in something that might have been contentment. The chickens were still and quiet on their roost. And beneath Carrie's boots, the packed earth floor did not pull the heat from her feet the way the wooden planks of the cabin did. She stood there with a milk pail in her hand and did not move for almost a full minute. Inside the cabin behind her, Etta was coughing. That wet, rattling sound that frontier mothers learned to recognize and fear. It had started in December, and it had not stopped. Carrie had tried everything she knew to try, kept the girl close to the fire, made her drink hot broth, layered her under every blanket and quilt in the house, and still every morning that sound. The bedroom where Etta and her older sister Winnie slept was the coldest room in the cabin. Heat from the hearth rose to the ceiling and leaked through the roof boards and disappeared into the night. The plank floor conducted cold directly from the frozen ground below. Carrie had been waking 3 and 4 times each night to add wood, and by morning the fire was down to embers and the bedroom was barely above freezing, and Etta was coughing. Standing in the barn with the animals breathing their small, warm clouds around her, Carrie thought something she had not put into words before even to herself. The animals slept warmer than her children. She stayed in the barn longer than she needed to that morning. She did her chores slowly thinking, and while she was thinking, a memory surfaced the way memories do when you are not looking for them. Her husband Delbert, at the kitchen table on a summer evening in 1883, coming in from a long day at the Hartley property, 3 miles north where he had been sinking a well. Delbert had been a well digger for 8 years before they bought their land. It was not glamorous work. It was hard, slow, dirty, and occasionally dangerous. But he had done it well, and he had known things from doing it that most men did not know. He had come in that evening and washed his hands and sat down, and he had said almost to himself, "The deeper you go, the warmer she holds." Carrie had not asked him to explain it. She had been busy with supper, and he had not offered anything further. He was not a man who talked a great deal. He made his observations and left them on the table, and you could pick them up or leave them as you chose. He had been dead for nearly 2 years. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Carrie went to the wooden chest where she kept his things. The suit he had worn on their wedding day, a folding knife, a photograph from before she had known him, and at the bottom his work journal, a thin leather notebook he had carried in his coat pocket for most of his working life, and used to record the measurements and conditions of every well he had ever dug. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and read through it. Page after page of numbers and observations in Delbert's careful, unpretentious handwriting, depths and diameters, soil types, water table levels, and temperatures. On the last page he had filled dated March 14th, 1884, a well for the Hartley family. At 8 feet ground temperature 48 degrees. Frost line stops at 4 feet. Below that, earth holds steady regardless of surface. Carrie read those words twice. Then she sat back and looked at the wall. The earth holds steady, it always has. She had not heard Delbert say those exact words, but reading them in his handwriting in the careful ink of a man who measured things before he said them, she heard his voice as clearly as if he were sitting across the table. She closed the notebook. She did not go to bed for another hour. She was thinking about where the frost line stopped. By the end of February, she had something else to think about. The cattle were behaving strangely. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing you only noticed if you were paying close attention to animals you knew well. Every evening, her two milk cows drifted to the southeast corner of the barn and pressed against each other, there facing the same direction. They would not stand near the north wall, even when the feed was better positioned there. The mule had taken to sleeping in the center of the barn rather than in its usual stall along the east side. Carrie mentioned it to old Luther one afternoon when she saw him passing on the road. Luther was 72 years old and had been farming in this valley since before it was properly a valley, since before there were enough people to call it a community. He had survived the winter of 1880, the one people still talked about in lowered voices. The winter that had killed 40 head of cattle in the surrounding area and two men who should have known better. He came and stood at the barn door and looked at the animals for a while without speaking. The winter of 80, he said at last. My cattle did the same thing, pressed to the south wall every night a week before the worst of it. I had other things on my mind. I didn't pay attention. He paused. Lost 11 head. He looked at Carrie steadily. He did not ask why she was paying attention to where her cows chose to sleep. He did not ask what she was planning. He just nodded once, the way a man nods when he has said what needed saying, and walked back to the road. Carrie stood in the barn doorway and watched him go. She was already thinking about the March thaw. She was already thinking about a shovel. The first problem was the east wall. She began digging on a Wednesday in mid-March when the ground had softened enough to work, but before the valley had woken up enough to watch her. She worked in the early hours before sunrise, before her daughters were up, before anyone passing on the county road could see what she was doing in the north corner of her barn. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. She did not ask permission. She had not asked anyone's permission for anything since Delbert died, because there was no one whose permission she needed. The land was hers. The barn was hers. The labor was hers. On the 8th day after a night of hard rain, she climbed down into the excavation and found that the east wall had collapsed. 3 days of work buried under a dark, wet slump of Montana clay. She sat in the hole and looked at it. Winnie came to the edge of the excavation above her and looked down. Winnie was 12, practical in the way children of widows on the frontier learned to be practical early. She looked at the collapsed wall, looked at her mother, and said, Mama, maybe we just buy more wood. Carrie did not answer right away. She was thinking about something Delbert had told her once about well digging. You lined the walls before you went deeper. You did not excavate and then try to stabilize. You stabilized as you went. She had inverted the sequence. She stood up, picked up the shovel, and began clearing the debris. She had made an error. She corrected it. There was nothing more to be said about it. She spent the next 2 weeks lining the walls as she dug fitting limestone blocks from the creek bed into place before removing the earth behind them. The stone was heavy, and the creek was half a mile away, and she made the trip with a handcart more times than she bothered to count. The blocks had to be split and shaped with a hand sledge and chisel work that left her palms raw and her back aching in the hours before dawn. She did not stop. She went down 8 feet before she hit bedrock and decided that was enough. She knew it was enough because Delbert had said the frost line stopped at 4 feet, and 8 feet was twice that margin. The room she was creating measured 10 feet by 12, modest but sufficient, larger than the bedroom where her daughters had been freezing it all winter. The ceiling was the piece she thought about longest. The barn floor above had to bear the weight of animals, hay, and equipment year-round. A failure there was not an option she was willing to consider. She salvaged 8-inch timber beams from an abandoned homestead 5 miles north, loading them onto the wagon by herself one at a time. She notched them into the limestone walls rather than resting them on the earth itself, a decision she made because Delbert had described in one of his journal entries how a well casing transferred load to bedrock to avoid subsidence. The principle was the same. Put the weight on rock, not on ground that moved and settled with the seasons. Between the beams, she fitted split planks tight, then packed 6 inches of clay on top of them. The barn floor above remained intact. From inside the barn, walking across it, you would not have known anything was below. In May, she tried to install the ventilation. She ran a pipe vertically up through the barn floor, thinking the rising air from the heated room below would draw naturally upward and out. She lit a handful of dry straw in the excavation as a test. The smoke turned back and came down at her. She sat with this for 3 days. She could not understand why the draft reversed until she stood outside on a windy afternoon and watched the grass near the barn and paid attention to the way the air moved across the ground. Pressure from the wind above was pushing back down any vertical opening it could find. A straight pipe up was an invitation for the outside air to come in. She changed the design entirely. She ran the pipe horizontally through the limestone wall, then up the outside of the barn where it merged with the existing chimney structure. The stovepipe from the small cast iron stove did the same, entering the barn's existing flue from below. From outside the property from the county road, it looked like a normal barn with a single chimney. Nothing unusual, nothing worth a second glance. When she tested it again with the straw, the smoke rose clean and steady. She installed the small stove in early October. It was a salvaged piece barely 2 feet square from a burned-out claim cabin she had permission to pick over. She ran a second ventilation shaft using a hollow fence post, fitted through the barn floor, disguised to look like a structural support. Fresh air could enter from outside, get warmed by the stove before it spread through the living space, and stale air would rise and exit through the flue. She had read about carbon monoxide, the invisible killer that had taken a family in Bozeman the previous winter, and she was not cavalier about it. 3 separate pathways. She checked each one. By the time the first hard frost came in early November, the room below was complete. Stone walls, timber ceiling, a small stove, 2 simple bed frames, an oil lamp, and a shelf for books, and the few things that mattered. She carried the girls' bedding down through the trapdoor one evening and said nothing explanatory about it. Winnie came down, looked around at the low ceiling and rough walls and the smell of earth and limestone and asked, "Are we hiding?" "No," Carrie said. "We're staying warm." She lit the stove with 6 logs. Within an hour, the room had climbed to 58 degrees. In a Montana November, 58 degrees felt like something close to luxury. What Carrie had not anticipated was how quickly word would travel. Winnie mentioned the underground room to a girl she knew at the settlement store. The girl told her mother. The mother told 2 other women. By the second week of November, most of the valley knew that Carrie Braddock was living under her barn like a root vegetable, and opinions on the matter were strong and unflattering. Mrs. Clementine Granger, a preacher's wife, who had arrived from Ohio that fall and had not yet experienced a full Montana winter, heard about it at the dry goods counter and pressed her lips together. "Sleeping beneath animals," she said to no one in particular. "It isn't natural, it's degrading." Myrtle Whitfield, whose husband ran the only lumber supply in the region, was more specific in her assessment. "She's given up trying to be civilized," she told the women who gathered at her kitchen table on Thursday afternoons. "That's what happens when a woman's left alone too long. The standards go." The men were less vocal in public, but no less dismissive in private. They talked about structure, about safety, about basic common sense. When Aldous Galt, a carpenter of some reputation traveling through on his way to Helena, stopped at Otis Cravath's farm for 2 nights and heard the story, he asked to be shown the setup. Cravath walked him over. Carrie showed him the room. Galt stood in the underground space for perhaps 30 seconds. He looked at the ceiling beams. He looked at the stovepipe. He looked at the ventilation shaft. Then he looked at Carrie with an expression she recognized, the expression of a skilled man who had already made his decision and was trying to find a polite way to deliver it. "Ma'am," he said, "this is a fine way to suffocate when that ventilation clogs or get crushed when those beams settle wrong under load. I've seen men with proper engineering training and attempt things like this. It generally doesn't end well." He meant it as a warning. He did not mean it unkindly. Carrie told him the beams were notched into bedrock, not subsoil. She told him there were 3 independent ventilation pathways. She told him the stove drew clean, and she had tested every opening. Galt listened. He nodded the way a person nods when they are not really listening but do not want to be rude about it. "I hope you're right, ma'am, for your girl's sake." He left the next morning. Carrie went back to her work. The mockery, the head shakes, the quiet pity, none of it was malicious. People did not wish her harm. They simply could not imagine that someone without formal training, without a husband, without the credentials that the frontier treated as a proxy for competence, could engineer something that functioned. Different meant wrong. Unconventional meant dangerous. And so they watched in the way communities watch someone they expect to fail, waiting for the moment when Carrie Braddock would have to admit her mistake and return to freezing the normal way. She did not argue with any of them. She did not try to persuade anyone. She simply continued her routine morning chores in the barn descent, through the trapdoor, small fire in the stove, stable warmth through the night, and back up at dawn. But then in the 3rd week of November, Merritt Whitfield came to see her himself. Merritt Whitfield was not the kind of man who sent messages when he could deliver them in person. He was the sole supplier of lumber and firewood in a 20-mile radius, a position he had built deliberately over 12 years, and he was not inclined towards sentimentality in business matters. He arrived at the Braddock property on a Tuesday morning without announcement, tied his horse at the fence post, and knocked on the barn door rather than the cabin, which told Carrie he already knew where to find her. She opened the door. He stood there in his good coat with his hat in one hand and a document in the other. He told her that he had reviewed the outstanding credit account that her husband Delbert had opened with the Whitfield Lumber Company in 1883, and that she had continued in the years since Delbert's death. He told her that the balance was not inconsiderable. He told her that given the nature of her recent projects, he felt it was necessary to clarify the terms. Then he told her what the terms were. The debt plus interest had to be settled in full before the first day of December. If it was not, he would exercise his right under the original credit agreement to recover the collateral Delbert had offered in 1883, which was a 12-acre parcel on the eastern border of the Braddock property, the parcel that contained the only reliable water source for the farm through the summer months. He said all of this pleasantly. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice to make a point. Carrie looked at him. She looked at the document in his hand. She thought about the 12 acres he was describing, about the spring that ran through it in April and May, and the shallow well that fed from it all summer, about what losing access to that water would mean for the farm, for the cattle, for any possibility of staying on the land at all. She thought about all of that in approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "I'll need to make some arrangements." Whitfield nodded pleasantly. He put his hat back on. He reminded her that December 1st was 11 days away. Then he rode back down the county road toward town. Carrie stood in the barn doorway and watched him go. She did not have the money. She had almost no money at all. What little she had was committed to feed into the property taxes that came due in the spring. Delbert had managed the finances during his life with the kind of careful, narrow margin that left no room for unexpected claims. She had 11 days. That night, after the girls were in bed in the underground room, and the stove had been lit and the lamp was burning low, Carrie sat on the edge of her own bed frame with Delbert's journal in her hands. She did not open it. She just held it. She thought about Galt and his warning. She thought about Myrtle Whitfield and her Thursday afternoon assessments. She thought about Winnie saying, "Maybe we just buy more wood," and about Etta's cough that had finally in the past 2 weeks begun to quiet, about what that meant, about what it would mean to go back to the cabin, to the freezing bedroom, to the sound she had been listening for every night for months. She set the journal on the shelf and opened it to the last page Delbert had written. She read the words she had already memorized. Then she closed the journal. The room was at 56 degrees. The stove ticked quietly as it cooled. Outside, the temperature was dropping towards zero, and the wind had shifted to come out of the north. Carrie did not move for a long time. She was thinking about Delbert, about what he would have done, not because she needed his permission. She had not needed anyone's permission for 2 years. But because he had known things she was still learning, and she was trying to hear what he would have seen in this that she might be missing. What she kept coming back to was the last line in that journal entry. Below that, earth holds steady regardless of surface. Regardless of surface. Regardless of what was happening above. Regardless of who was demanding what. Regardless of what people said about her at Thursday afternoon kitchen tables. Regardless of what a carpenter from Helena thought about her ventilation system. 8 feet down, the temperature did not change. The earth did not negotiate with the weather or the opinion of neighbors. It simply held. She was not certain she was right. That was the truth she had not said aloud to anyone. She had built this room on a set of principles she understood but had not proven based on the journal of a man who had measured temperatures in wells, not in underground bedrooms. She had made her best engineering decisions based on reasoning she believed was sound. But belief and proof were different things. She thought about Etta's cough, the way it had quieted in the 2 weeks since they had moved below, the way the girl was sleeping through the night for the first time since November of the previous year. Some proof was already in front of her. It was not enough to make her certain, but it was enough to make her stay. 2 days after Whitfield's visit, old Luther came by the barn again. It was late afternoon and the light had already given up and gone gray, and Luther stood in the barn doorway with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the animals. "My cattle moved to the south wall this morning," he said. "All of them, every last one." He paused. The last time they did that was November of 1880. He turned and walked back toward the road without waiting for a response. Carrie stood in the barn and listened to the sound of his boots on the frozen ground getting quieter, then gone. 1880, the winter that had killed 11 of his cattle and 2 men in the valley. The winter people still described in lowered voices. She looked at her own cattle pressed together in the southeast corner of the barn. Merritt Whitfield wanted his money in 11 days. The eastern parcel and its water would be at risk if she could not produce it. And the oldest cattleman in the valley had just told her, without quite saying so, that what was coming was not an ordinary winter. She pulled the barn door shut against the wind. She had 11 days in a room 8 feet underground and a stove barely 2 feet square, and 2 daughters who were for the first time in months sleeping through the night. Whatever was coming, she was ready for it in a way she had not been before. The question was whether ready would be enough. She wrote the letter to the lawyer in Bozeman the same night Luther told her about his cattle. She did not have a lawyer of her own. She had never needed one. But her brother in Illinois had mentioned in a letter 2 summers ago the name of a man in Bozeman who handled land disputes for homesteaders in the territory, a man named Caldwell, who charged reasonable fees and did not require payment until a matter was resolved. Carrie had kept the name written on the inside cover of her recipe book, the way she kept things she did not need yet, but suspected she might. She wrote the letter by lamplight at the kitchen table, which felt strange. Now the kitchen table in the cabin, because she had not sat at it in the evening for 3 weeks. The cabin was cold, the way it had always been cold in the bones of it, in the mold and floor, in the air that moved through gaps she could never fully seal. She kept her coat on while she wrote. She described the original credit agreement Delbert had signed with Merritt Whitfield in 1883. She described the collateral, the 12 eastern acres. She described what Whitfield had told her on Tuesday morning and what he intended to do if she did not produce the full debt amount by December 1st. Then she folded the letter and addressed it and set it on the table to dry. She needed someone to carry it to Bozeman before the roads closed. In the morning, she went to see Otis Cravath. Cravath was splitting wood in his yard when she came up the lane, working with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had been splitting wood since he was old enough to hold an axe. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, the kind of neighbor who showed up when there was real work to be done and did not say much while doing it. He had helped her get her hay in the previous August without being asked, which was the highest form of neighborly courtesy on the frontier. She told him what she needed. She asked if he could make the trip to Bozeman before the first hard snow. He set the axe down and looked at the sky. It was a flat white sky, the kind that did not tell you much, but he had been reading Montana skies for 20 years, and he read this one for a moment before he answered. "I can go day after tomorrow," he said. "Roads still passable, but Mrs. Braddock—" He stopped. "I don't know how long it stays that way. Storm that's building out of the north could close everything before Christmas." "I know," she said. "Go when you can." He took the letter. She walked back to her own property through the cold and went down through the trap door and sat on the edge of her bed frame for a while in the warmth of the room and thought about what she had set in motion and whether it would be enough and whether it would arrive in time. There was nothing to do but wait. Waiting, she had found, was not a passive condition on a working farm in November. There was always something that needed doing, always some gap between what was finished and what still required attention. She spent the days after Cravath left working through the lists she had been maintaining in her head. Since September, the list of things the room still needed before the serious cold arrived. She waterproofed the seam where the stovepipe passed through the limestone wall. She replaced 2 of the split planks in the ceiling that had developed a slight bow after the first hard frost. She moved the girls' books down from the cabin and their winter clothes and the tin of dried herbs she used for medicine and the small wooden box that held Delbert's folding knife and the photograph from before she had known him. The photograph she set on the shelf above the stove, not as sentiment, as company. On the 5th of November, Myrtle Whitfield came calling. She arrived with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, which was the standard currency of a social visit that wanted to disguise itself as something more casual than it was. Carrie accepted the bread and did not open the trap door. She walked Myrtle through the barn, showing her the animals, the hay storage, the repaired section of south wall, where a board had worked loose in October. Myrtle looked at all of it with the patient attention of a woman searching for something specific. She looked at the stack of feed sacks in the northwest corner longer than anything else. "Where are the girls sleeping?" she asked. "Somewhere warm," Carrie said. Myrtle turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite friendly and not quite hostile, something balanced precisely between concern and accusation. "Carrie, people are talking." "People are always talking," Carrie said. "It's November. There isn't much else to do." Myrtle left the bread and left the barn, and Carrie watched her go through the small window near the south wall. She watched her walk back to the road with her back very straight, the walk of a woman who had not gotten what she came for. Three other women stopped by that same afternoon on various pretexts. Carrie spoke to all of them at the barn door, and none of them got further than the barn door. She was not hiding. She had told Cravath that, and she meant it. But she had learned something from Delbert about letting work speak before you try to explain it. He had never argued about a well he was digging. He finished it, then pointed at the water. The water did the explaining for him. She was not finished yet. 5 days later, Myrtle came back, this time without bread. She stood just inside the barn door with her hands folded in front of her and told Carrie that she had discussed the matter with Merritt, and Merritt felt that the December 1st deadline might need to be moved forward if Carrie continued to, as Myrtle put it, create uncertainty in the community about the right way to manage a winter homestead. Carrie listened to all of it without speaking. When Myrtle finished, Carrie said, "Myrtle, when have I ever told anyone in this valley how to manage their homestead?" Myrtle opened her mouth and closed it. "I'm not a school teacher," Carrie said. "I'm not a preacher. I haven't knocked on a single door and told a single person what to do with their barn or their firewood or their winter." "Have I?" Myrtle said nothing. "Then I'd appreciate it if Merritt would extend me the same courtesy," Carrie said. "I'll meet the terms as agreed." The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Myrtle left. Carrie went back to the morning chores she had interrupted to answer the door. But she stood at the water trough for a moment afterward, her hands still in the cold air, and acknowledged to herself that Whitfield was not going to stop. He had sent his wife first, which meant he was testing her, measuring how much pressure she would absorb before she changed course. He would send something else next. She did not know what, but she knew enough about men like Merritt Whitfield to know that quiet compliance only confirmed to them that more pressure was possible. She finished the morning chores and went inside. 14 days to December 1st. No word yet from Bozeman. On the 20th of November, the first test came, not from Whitfield, from the weather. It was not the storm Luther had been warning about with his silences and his cattle. It was smaller than that, a single night of hard wind out of the northwest, temperature dropping to 10 below gusts that made the barn walls shudder on their foundations. By frontier standards, it was a difficult night, not a dangerous one, and most of the valley slept through it with only the usual precautions. Carrie woke at 2 in the morning, not to sound, to absence of sound. The stove had been burning low and steady when she had fallen asleep, and the room had been at its normal nighttime temperature, and there had been the usual quiet that existed 8 feet below the surface of the ground, while the wind moved above it. What she woke to was a change in the air. She lay still for a moment, eyes open in the dark, checking the information her body was giving her. Then she got up, without lighting the lamp, and walked slowly along the east wall with her palm flat against the stone. She found it at the northeast corner, where the ventilation pipe passed through the wall. One section of the seal she had applied in October had contracted in the cold and pulled away from the stone by what felt under her fingertips like a quarter of an inch. A quarter of an inch of gap in a wall 8 feet underground during a windstorm was not nothing. She could feel the faint pulse of cold air moving through it, not a draft, barely a breath, but enough. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up, found the tin of clay mixture she kept on the supply shelf, and packed the gap by touch, alone in the dark. She pressed it in with her thumb, working slowly and thoroughly, making sure it seated properly against both the stone and the pipe. Then she went back to bed and lay there for an hour, not sleeping, checking the air temperature with the skin of her arms, the way she checked the temperature of the room every few hours without thinking about it consciously. The cold breath from the corner had stopped. The room was stable. She was awake at 5 to start the morning chores as usual. She told no one about it, not because she wanted to conceal a flaw, but because the flaw had been found and corrected, and that was what building anything actually looked like. Delbert had always said that a structure that had never been tested had never been finished. The first test had found the one gap she had missed. She had fixed it in the dark in the middle of a windstorm. That seemed to her like exactly how things were supposed to work. But lying awake in that hour before dawn, she had also thought about Galt, about his ventilation concerns, about the way he had left without quite believing her and without quite being willing to say so. She had been so certain and the seal gap had been real. She did not let herself follow that thought all the way to its conclusion. There was no useful end to that corridor. She got up and went to work. Old Luther came to see the underground room on the 7th of December. He did not knock. He walked into the barn the way a man walks into a place he has been invited before, even though he had never been invited, and found Carrie at the northwest corner, moving the feed sacks aside. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and watched. "I'd like to see it," he said. She lifted the trapdoor. He descended the ladder ahead of her, which surprised her the way an old man moves when he has made a decision and does not intend to waste time being polite about it. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at the walls the way a farmer looks at a field trying to understand what the ground had to say. He went to the east wall and put his palm flat against the limestone. He stood there for a long time. Then he moved to the north wall and did the same thing. Then the west. He was not inspecting the construction. He was reading the stone the way he read his cattle, looking for what it was telling him about something larger. "Limestone," he said. "From the creek," Carrie said. He nodded once. "Heavy stone. Holds heat." He kept his palm flat on the wall. "My father used to say, 'Ask the rock, not the fire, to keep you warm.' I thought he was a foolish old man." He stood there another moment. Then he turned and looked at the lamp and the two beds and the shelf with Delbert's photograph on it and the small stove cold in the corner. "The big storm," he said. "It'll be 3 days, maybe more. You'll want extra water stored down here before it starts. The creek will be solid." He went back to the ladder without waiting for her to respond. At the bottom rung, he paused. "Your seal work on that northeast corner. Check it again before the storm. Temperature drop on a 3-day blow will be different than what you've seen so far." Then he climbed up and crossed the barn floor and went out the door, and that was that. Carrie stood alone in the room for a moment. Luther had been farming in this valley for 30 years. He had never, to anyone's knowledge, told a neighbor she was doing something right. He had never, to anyone's knowledge, told a neighbor anything at all unless he thought it was worth saying. She looked at the northeast corner. She had already repacked it once. She got the clay tin from the shelf and packed it again. Aldous Galt came back on the 15th of December. He arrived from Helena on a gray afternoon without announcement, which seemed to be how Galt operated in general, and he went directly to the barn rather than the cabin, which meant someone had told him where to look. He stood in the doorway with a canvas bag over one shoulder and said he wanted to see the room again. Carrie let him down. This time he did not stand in the middle and look at the ceiling and shake his head. This time he worked. He went to each beam in turn and put his weight against it, testing the notch, feeling for movement. He pulled on the ventilation pipe where it passed through the wall. He traced the stove pipe with his hands from the stove to the point where it entered the barn's flue system. He spent 8 minutes on the northeast corner where the pipe seal was and checked it in a way that told her he had been thinking about exactly that point. Carrie watched him and said nothing. After 40 minutes, he sat down on the bottom step of the ladder and looked at the floor for a while. "The low distribution," he said, "notching into bedrock rather than subsoil, that is not a guess. That is a decision made by someone who understood what they were deciding." He paused. "Your husband dig wells?" 8 years, Carrie said. He nodded the way he had nodded before, but differently. Not the nod of a man being polite. The nod of a man putting a piece into a structure that had been missing a piece. "The ventilation is better than I would have designed it," he said. He reached into the canvas bag and took out a small object and set it on the step beside him. It was a candle holder, iron, narrow, and cylindrical shaped, so the candle sat inside a partial sleeve rather than on an open surface. "Carbon monoxide pulls oxygen from the bottom of a space upward," he said. "By the time a person sleeping on a low bed feels it, there may not be time. A regular candle in open air does not give you adequate warning." He picked up the holder. "This one will. The flame responds earlier than your lungs do. If it goes out in the night without a draft to explain it, you open that trap door and you go up. You don't investigate, you go up." He set it on the shelf above the stove. "My concern was never your structure," he said. "I was wrong about the structure. My concern now is fire load in an enclosed space during a 3-day storm when you may not be able to vent additional heat easily." He stood up. "The candle addresses the risk I could not solve with carpentry." He started up the ladder. Carrie said, "Mr. Galt." He stopped. "You told me this would kill us," she said. In your sleep, you said. He looked back at her from the middle of the ladder. I did. And now you're telling me the structure is sound. Yes, he said. A pause. I was looking at the wrong failure point, he said. That happens. A man who cannot admit it is a man you should not hire for any work that matters. He continued up the ladder. The candle addresses the right failure point. Don't let it go out twice without checking why. Then he was gone. Carrie stood in the room alone, looking at the iron candle holder on the shelf above the stove. She picked it up and held it for a moment. It was heavier than it looked, carefully made. She thought about what it meant that Galt had come back, that he had spent 40 minutes in her room checking work he had already dismissed, that he had come with something in the bag before he had even confirmed whether he still had doubts. She set the candle holder back on the shelf. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 8 degrees since morning. On the 22nd of December, Etta got sick. Not the slow cough that had defined the previous winter, the cough that had been building for weeks before Carrie fully understood what she was dealing with. This was sudden and direct a fever that came on between afternoon and evening and pushed the girl's temperature high enough that Carrie could feel it before she touched her forehead. 102, maybe a little more. Carrie sat beside the bed through most of that night. She checked the candle flame on the shelf. It burned straight and even no flicker, no sign of the invisible pressure she was now trained to watch for. The air in the room was clean. The fever was not from the room. But sitting there in the quiet, watching the candle and listening to Etta breathe, Carrie ran through every decision she had made over the past 9 months. Not in the organized way you review something you are proud of. In the disorganized, grinding way, you review something you are afraid might have been a mistake. The east wall collapsed in March that had cost 3 days. The ventilation pipe she had designed wrong the first time and had to rebuild. The seal in the northeast corner that had opened during the November windstorm. 3 things that had gone wrong, 3 things she had caught and corrected, but 3 things nonetheless. Galt had been wrong about the structure. He had admitted it, but he had been right that there was a risk he had not originally identified, and he had been right enough about that risk to come back with a tool to address it. What else had she missed that she had not yet found? She looked at Delbert's photograph on the shelf. The light from the lamp was low, and the image was barely visible, just the shape of a man who had known things she was still learning. She thought about what he would have said, not as comfort, but as assessment. He had been a practical man. He had not been given to reassurance. When a well had a problem, he described the problem first and then described the solution. He did not soften either. She thought about what he would say about Etta's fever. He would say it was a fever. He would say children got fevers. He would say watch her and keep her warm and see what morning brought. The room was at 54 degrees. Etta was under 2 blankets. The air smelled of stone and lamp oil and the dry warmth of a small fire that had been burning cleanly for 6 weeks. Morning brought a temperature of 99 and a child who wanted breakfast, which Carrie took as the most reliable diagnosis available on the frontier. By the 25th of December, Etta was fully recovered and annoyed at having been kept in bed for 3 days. On the 2nd of January, Otis Cravath came back from Bozeman. He came to the barn in the late afternoon, his coat still showing the dust of the road, and handed Carrie a sealed envelope. She could tell from his face that he thought the contents were significant and that he was trying not to show it, which was the particular expression of a man who respected someone enough not to manage their reactions for them. She opened the letter. The lawyer's name was Caldwell, as her brother had said. He had reviewed the original credit agreement between Delbert Braddock and Merritt Whitfield dated April 1883. He had found in the 4th paragraph of the 2nd page a clause that neither Delbert nor apparently Whitfield had paid much attention to at signing. Under territorial statute, when the primary obligant of a secured credit agreement died, the recovery period on collateral was automatically extended by 3 years from the date of death, a provision designed to protect dependent families from immediate dispossession. Delbert had died in July of 1885. 3 years from July of 1885 was July of 1888, 7 months away. Merritt Whitfield did not have the legal right to recover the eastern parcel until the summer of 1888 at the earliest. His December 1st deadline had no legal foundation. Carrie folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Cravath was watching her. "Is it useful?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She did not say anything else for a moment. She was thinking about Delbert, about the 4th paragraph of the 2nd page of an agreement he had signed in 1883 and probably never reread. about the way a careful man's habits protected people he could no longer protect himself. She took a clean sheet of paper from the supply shelf and wrote a single paragraph copying the relevant clause from Caldwell's letter in her own hand and noting the statutory reference he had provided. She folded it and wrote Merritt Whitfield's name on the outside. "Would you take this to Whitfield on your way home?" she asked Cravath. He looked at the folded paper. "That's all, just the paper." "That's all," she said. "No message." Cravath left. Carrie stood in the barn after he was gone and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite a relief, but was somewhere in the territory of both. She had not confronted Whitfield. She had not argued with him. She had not asked anyone to intervene on her behalf in any emotional or dramatic way. She had found a fact and she had sent it to him, and now the fact would do what facts do when they are pointed at the right problem. She went down through the trap door and lit the stove. 9 days later, on the morning of January 9th, old Luther came to the barn for the last time before the storm. He arrived at dusk, which was unusual. Luther was a morning man, a man who made his visits and his observations in the early hours and was home before noon. Coming at dusk meant he had not planned this visit. He had seen something or felt something during the day that had brought him here. He stood outside the barn door and did not come in. "Storm's coming," he said, "tonight or early morning." Carrie had been tracking the sky for 2 days, she knew. "How bad?" He looked north. The sky in that direction had turned a color she had heard older settlers describe, a yellow that was more green than gold, the color of light filtered through something that had no business being above the valley. "Bad enough," he said. He turned to go, then stopped. "You have everything you need." "I think so," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking back at her, "Think so and know so are different things on a night like this, Mrs. Braddock." He walked back down the lane toward the road. Carrie stood in the barn doorway until she could no longer hear his boots on the frozen ground. Then she went inside and began the final preparations she had been planning in her head since November. She carried 4 extra buckets of water down through the trap door and set them along the north wall. She moved the remaining dry wood from the barn floor storage into the underground room, stacking it against the south wall in careful rows. She checked the northeast corner seal a 3rd time, pressing her palm against it, feeling for any breath of outside air. Nothing. She checked the candle holder on the shelf, replaced the candle with a full one, and lit it. She brought Winnie and Etta down before sunset while there was still enough light coming through the small, ground-level window to do it without the lamp. Winnie carried her books. Etta carried the rag doll she pretended she was too old to care about. Carrie closed the trap door above them. The stove was lit. The candle burned straight. The water was stored. The wood was stacked. The seal on the northeast corner had held through the November wind and through 3 repackings, and it would hold again. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at Delbert's photograph on the shelf. The lamp was turned low. The room was warming. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning, not the gusting, irregular wind of a bad night. This was different. This was the sound of something organized and committed, something that had made up its mind. Winnie looked up from her book and said, "It's starting." "I know," Carrie said. "Are we going to be all right?" Carrie looked at the stone walls, at the ceiling beams, each one notched into bedrock rather than into ground that moved, at the candle flame standing perfectly still in air that the earth itself was holding steady. "Yes," she said. She said it the way Luther had taught her to say it, not as comfort and not as prediction, but as something she had earned the right to know. The wind outside rose and did not stop. At 1 in the morning, she woke to a sound from directly above her. Not the storm, not the structure settling. Something inside the barn. A sharp crack followed by the low, distressed sound of an animal in pain. She lay still for 3 seconds, placing it. The east side of the barn, the cattle stalls, not the roof, not a beam. She got up. She looked at the candle. She looked at her daughters, both asleep. She looked at the trap door. If one of the cows had broken through a stall board, the gap in the wall would let the storm inside the barn. The barn temperature would drop. The animals would be exposed. And the passive warmth that rose through the floorboards every night, the warmth she had never once had to pay for or plan for because it simply existed as long as the animals were alive and sheltered, that would diminish. She pulled on her coat and her boots. Winnie sat up from her bed. "Mama, stay here," Carrie said. "Don't open this door unless I knock 3 times. She climbed the ladder, pushed the trap door, and stepped up into the barn. The cold hit her like a physical force. Not the stable cold of the underground room's worst morning, but the aggressive attacking cold of a storm at full strength, and the barn, which had been a refuge from it, was no longer quite a refuge. A board on the northeast corner of the cattle stall had given way, and the wind was coming through the gap in a steady, purposeful stream. One of the cows stood as far from the gap as the stall would allow, shaking. Carrie went to the tool wall without being able to see it, navigating by memory, and found the spare board she had stored there in October. She found the mallet. She went to the gap by following the cold and the sound. She worked by feel. The wind was not interested in giving her any assistance. Her hands lost useful sensation after 4 minutes. She finished the repair in 6, not clean, not her best work, but solid, the board seated across the gap and held. She checked it with her palm. No more stream of air. She stood next to the cow and put both hands under its neck, where the body heat was highest, holding them there until sensation returned. Then she went back to the trap door. She knocked 3 times. The door opened from below. Winnie's face looked up at her from the lamplight with an expression that was trying hard not to be frightened and mostly succeeding. Carrie climbed down. She pulled the trap door shut above her. She looked at the candle on the shelf. It burned straight and still steady in air that was 53 degrees and holding. She looked at Etta asleep in her bed, 2 blankets pulled to her chin, breathing the quiet breath of a child who had no idea what was happening above her, and no reason to. Carrie took off her coat and sat down on her own bed. She did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said. The work had been done in the only place work ever actually happened, in the dark, in the cold, without an audience, without the option of stopping. Outside, the storm pressed against the Montana earth with everything it had. 8 feet below the earth did not answer. The storm did not stop on the second day. Carrie knew it would not. Luther had said 3 days, maybe more, and Luther had never been imprecise about weather when precision was available to him. She tracked time by the candle, by the small increments of gray light that came and went through the ground-level window, by the intervals between adding wood to the stove. The world above the trap door had ceased to be a place she thought about in terms of other people. It had become a set of conditions she monitored and managed and otherwise left alone. On the morning of the second day, she climbed up to check the animals. The board she had nailed in the dark on the first night had held. The cows were standing close together, not distressed, just patient in the way cattle are patient, the way animals are patient when they have shelter and feed, and nothing is actively threatening them. She forked out extra hay, checked the water buckets, which had not frozen, because the barn's own thermal envelope was doing what she had always understood it would do, and went back down. Winnie was awake when she returned, sitting cross-legged on her bed, with a book open in her lap and a look on her face that was neither frightened nor entirely calm, the particular expression of a 12-year-old who has decided to be mature about something and is working hard at it. "How bad is it up there?" Winnie asked. "About the same as yesterday," Carrie said. "That's not really an answer." "No," Carrie agreed, "it's not." She hung her coat and sat down and picked up the mending she had brought down the previous week. The needle was difficult to thread in lamplight, but she had been doing it in difficult light for most of her adult life. She threaded it. "Are the cravats all right?" Winnie asked. It was a question Carrie had been carrying for 2 days without a way to answer it. Otis had told her in December that he was going to move his youngest children into the animal shelter for the worst nights after seeing what she had built. Whether he had done it, whether it had been enough, whether Owen's fingers had recovered fully from the frostbite, she could not know until the storm broke. "I expect so," she said. "Otis Cravath is a careful man." Winnie considered this and went back to her book. Etta slept through most of the second day, which was her natural response to being confined to a small space with nothing new happening, and Carrie did not discourage it. A sleeping child was a warm child, and a warm child was the entire point of every decision she had made since March. On the morning of the third day, the candle went out. She had been lying awake, not sleeping, but resting, monitoring the room with the particular attention she had developed over 6 weeks of living in it, the way a sailor learns to read a deck by feel. The candle was on the shelf above the stove, 6 feet from where she lay, and she saw the moment it went out, not a gutter and a struggle, but a clean extinguishing, as though the flame had simply decided to stop. She was on her feet before the thought fully formed. She reached Etta first, her hand finding the girl's face in the dark. Warm, breathing. She moved to Winnie. Breathing, she pressed the back of her own hand against her mouth and breathed out slowly through her nose. No dizziness, no heaviness behind the eyes, nothing that the body reports when it has been breathing something it should not breathe. She stood very still for a moment, cataloging. The room did not feel different. The air had no character she had not felt before. She moved to the northeast corner and held her palm against the pipe seal. Solid. She moved to the ventilation shaft and held her hand near it. A faint, very faint movement of air. The system was working. She found the matches on the supply shelf, struck one, and held it near the floor where Galt had told her carbon monoxide would pool first if it were present. The match burned normally. She lit another and held it at mid-height. Normal. She relit the candle. The flame stood straight, unhurried, exactly as it had stood for 6 weeks. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at it. Something had pushed through one of the ventilation pathways during a gust and snuffed the flame. A pressure differential, a moment when the storm found the geometry of the barn and sent a pulse of air down through a duct it had no business reaching. Not carbon monoxide, not structural failure, not any of the risks Galt had warned her about with his first assessment or his second. Just wine finding a way in, as wind always did. She had been terrified for approximately 90 seconds. She sat with that for a while. The terror had been clean and specific, and it had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had moved her body to the right places in the right sequence. She was not embarrassed by it. She was, in some way she could not quite articulate, grateful for it, the way you are grateful for a brake that holds on a steep grade even when you had not expected to need it. She set the candle on the floor rather than the shelf, lower and more sheltered, and went back to bed. In the morning, the wind stopped. Not gradually. All at once, like a door closing. One moment, the boards of the barn above her were creaking under steady pressure, and the next moment they were not, and the silence that followed was so complete it woke Etta from a sound sleep. "Mama," Etta said, "it stopped." "I know," Carrie said. She was already sitting up. She climbed the ladder and pushed the trapdoor and stepped into a barn that was cold, but not brutal. The cold of a space that had been stressed for 3 days and was now resting. She crossed to the barn door and pulled it open. The valley lay under a white so uniform and absolute that for a moment her eyes did not know how to read it. Snow to the thigh in the open areas, and higher where it had drifted against structures. The sky was the hard, clear blue that comes after a storm has spent everything. It had a sky with no apology in it, and no warmth either, but at least honesty. She stood in the barn doorway for a long moment. Every chimney in the valley she could see from this position was producing smoke, most of them thick and dark, the smoke of fires that had been fed everything available and were still barely keeping pace. She could see the Cravath property from here, a quarter-mile to the northeast. Smoke from the house chimney, thin and pale, which meant the fire was small, or the wood was wet, or both. And smoke from the smaller structure beside it, the animal shelter, a thicker plume, which told her Otis had done what he said he was going to do. She turned and looked at her own chimney pipe on the barn's north corner. The thin thread she had maintained for 3 days was barely visible now, just the residual warmth of a fire that had been moderate and deliberate and had never been asked to do more than what she had designed it to do. She went back inside, climbed down, and told the girls the storm was over. Otis Cravath came before noon. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of someone moving through deep snow, with the particular rhythm of a man covering ground rather than fighting it. She was in the barn forking hay when he knocked on the door, and she knew before she opened it that his face would tell her most of what she needed to know. He looked tired in the way that 3 days of managed crisis produces. Not broken, not defeated, but used up in a specific way that rest would address. His coat was dusted with dried snow. His eyes were clear. "Owen," she asked. "Fingers are fine," he said. "Came back fully. He's been sleeping." He paused. "My wife tended the fire through the nights. I moved the little ones into the animal shelter day 1. It was warmer." He said this last part carefully, not as an endorsement of anything, and not as an apology, just as a reported fact. "Is everyone in the valley accounted for?" Carrie asked. 2 families lost livestock. The Granger family ran out of dry wood on day 2. Reverend Granger burned the kitchen furniture. He stopped. "The Whitfield household." He stopped again with the expression of a man choosing words. "I understand it was a difficult 3 days for them." Carrie said nothing. "Your wood pile," he said, and then he could not find the rest of the sentence. "Come see where we slept," she said. She had said this to him before in the opening gray of the morning. The storm broke before she had known any of what she now knew, before any of the accounting had been done. She had said it because he had come to her and asked honestly, and honesty deserved honesty in return. She said it again now for a different reason. She lifted the trap door. He followed her down. He stood in the center of the room and pulled the thermometer from his coat pocket. He had been carrying it since the morning he first came, she noticed, which meant he had put it there on purpose. He held it still and read it. 58 degrees. The stove had not been lit since the previous evening. The night had been the coldest of the three, and the room had held. He looked at the number for a moment. Then he looked at Carrie. 10 logs, she said before he could ask. 12 on the worst nights. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. He was doing arithmetic that did not come out to any number he had a category for, and that kind of arithmetic took time. The stone absorbs the heat while the stove burns, she said, and gives it back slowly through the night. The earth on three sides holds a temperature that the surface never reaches in winter. The animals above add warmth just by living, and it rises through the floorboards without costing anything. She paused. Heat rises. I built a place where it had nowhere to go but stay. This was the only time she would explain it in full. She said it simply, and without Ella Cravath walked the perimeter, running his hand along the limestone. Dry. No ice on the walls, no moisture seeping from the packed earth ceiling. He looked at the two beds with their 2 blankets each, and then looked at the floor for a moment. Mrs. Braddock, he said, I owe you an apology. She shook her head. You don't owe me anything. I did not say anything when people talked about you. I had my own troubles, and I told myself it was none of my business. He kept looking at the floor. Owen has all his fingers because I paid attention to what you were doing. I should have paid attention before the storm. Otis, she said, which was the first time she had used his given name. I wasn't right or wrong. I was cold and my children were cold, and this made us less cold. That is all it ever was. He looked up at her. Bring whoever wants to see it, she said. I'm not hiding anything. He nodded. He climbed up the ladder, and she heard him cross the barn floor and go out. She stood alone in the room for a moment. She put her hand flat against the west wall. The limestone was warm under her palm, not the warmth of fire, not the warmth of the small stove that was cold in the corner, but the warmth of stone that had been doing its work quietly for 3 days without any help from her. The earth holds steady, it always has. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to. It was the temperature under her hand, and it was the breathing of her daughters from the night before, and it was 58 degrees on a thermometer, held still by a man who had burned his father's bench and come to find out why her chimney barely smoked. She went upstairs to feed the animals. Merritt Whitfield received her letter on the same day the storm broke. She knew this because Cravath confirmed it when he came back 2 days later with the beginnings of a list of neighbors who wanted to come see the underground room, a list that would eventually reach 11 families. He mentioned in passing that he had seen Whitfield come out of his office on the main road holding a piece of paper and stand in the cold for a minute before going back inside. He did not say anything more about it, and Carrie did not ask. She had sent him the copy of Caldwell's letter with no message attached because no message was needed. The clause in the 4th paragraph was unambiguous. The territorial statute was specific. The collateral could not be recovered until July of 1888. Any attorney Whitfield consulted would tell him the same thing in the same number of words. He did not come to see her. He did not send Myrtle. He did not write a letter or send a message through an intermediary. The demand that had arrived on her doorstep in November, precise and pleasant and certain of itself, was simply gone, withdrawn, without acknowledgement, like a hand pulled back from a surface that turned out to be hotter than expected. She had not won an argument. She had not confronted him or demanded anything, or asked anyone to stand up for her. She had found a fact and sent it to the person who needed to receive it, and the fact had done what facts do. That was the end of it. The 11 families came over the next 2 weeks on different days in small groups of 2 and 3. They came the way people come to see something they had decided against and now needed to reconsider, not with enthusiasm, but with the specific gravity of people who understood that the storm had been an exam and that they had not done as well on it as they might have. They came down the ladder one at a time and stood in the room and said very little. They ran their hands along the walls. They looked at the ceiling. Some of them looked at the 2 simple beds for a long time. A few of them looked at the thermometer readings Cravath had started keeping on a small piece of paper pinned to the shelf, a record of temperature by day and hour. Carrie answered questions when they were asked and did not offer explanations when they were not. She was not teaching anything. She was not demonstrating anything. She was letting people see a thing that existed and allowing them to form their own conclusions about it. Most of them left with a look she had come to recognize, the look of someone reorganizing information they thought they already had. Aldous Galt came back in February. She had not expected to see him again. He had a project in Helena, the boarding house he had mentioned in December, and Helena was 40 miles away, and February was not a month for unnecessary travel. But he came up the lane on a gray afternoon with a canvas roll under his arm and knocked on the barn door and did not pretend he had been passing through. She brought him down. He unrolled the canvas on the floor between them. It was a set of working drawings, careful and detailed in the way of a man who drew plans not for presentation, but for construction. 6 rooms arranged around a central masonry core, ventilation shafts at specific angles, load-bearing elements marked and noted. Below each room, labeled in Galt's small, precise hand, were the words Earth Contact. He did not look at her while she looked at the drawings. He looked at the wall. "I want to use the principles," he said. "Not copy your room, understand the architecture of what you did, and build something that applies it at a larger scale." She studied the drawings. They were good, better than good. He had solved problems she had not needed to solve because her room was small, and her purposes were simple problems of load distribution across multiple spans of shared ventilation systems, serving separate spaces of managing the thermal mass of a larger volume of stone. "Use it," she said. She pushed the drawings back toward him. "It's not mine to keep," she said. "My husband understood the principles. I applied them. You're extending them. That's how things are supposed to work." Galt rolled the drawings carefully and retied the canvas. Then he stayed on the step where he was sitting for a moment. "Whose was it then?" he said. "The idea." She thought about Delbert at the kitchen table in the summer of 1883, coming in from the Hartley well with his boots still carrying the deep cold smell of fresh dug earth. She thought about the line in his journal, written in the careful handwriting of a man who recorded things he observed because observation was what the work required. "My husband's," she said. "He just didn't know yet what it was for." Galt nodded once. He climbed the ladder. She heard him cross the barn and go out, and then the sound of his horse moving off down the county road toward Helena. She sat in the room alone for a while. The drawings he had made were careful and well considered, and she hoped the people who slept in those 6 rooms in Helena understood what kind of attention had gone into the thing that kept them warm. They probably would not. People rarely understood the attention that went into the structures that protected them. They felt the warmth and attributed it to the fire, which was the part they could see, and did not think about the stone and the earth and the geometry of heat that made the fire sufficient. That was all right. Delbert had not needed people to understand his wells. He had needed them to have water. Spring came late that year, as it often did after a hard winter, as though the cold needed extra time to be persuaded to leave. By mid-April, the ground had softened enough to work, and 3 families in the valley had already begun their own excavations. Otis Cravath dug beneath his chicken coop 8 by 8 feet and used the stone from his own creek bed. When Carrie walked by in May and saw the excavation, she saw that he had already made one change. She had not thought to make a small shelf cut directly into the limestone wall for lamp and matches and candle, a detail that spoke of someone who had slept in a dark room and thought about what would make it better. The Pritchett family, who ran a dairy operation and had more animals than anyone in the valley, went deeper than she had, 10 feet rather than 8, using sandstone from their eastern ridge. Sandstone, held differently than limestone, gave back heat more slowly over a longer period, and their room stayed warm enough into the deep night to store root vegetables without freezing, which meant they had solved 2 problems with the same excavation. Carrie heard about this from Cravath and thought Delbert would have approved of that kind of efficiency. The Chun family, who had worked a played-out mining claim for 3 years and knew more about working underground than anyone in the valley, built the most considered version of all. They had their room connected through the existing root cellar of their cabin, and they built into the north wall a sleeping platform raised above the floor with a small masonry fire channel running beneath it, a design she had never seen but recognized immediately as a form of what she had heard called a kang bed in descriptions of the northern territories of China. The platform stored heat in its mass and released it through the night in the same principle she had used with her walls, only sleeping directly on the warm surface rather than beside it. When she went to see it, the Chun wife showed her how it worked without speaking. Much demonstrating rather than explaining, which was a courtesy Carrie recognized because she had extended the same courtesy to others. She rode home in the April cold thinking about how knowledge moved, not in straight lines from teacher to student, in loops and parallels, people solving the same problem from different directions and arriving at overlapping answers, each answer carrying the particular knowledge of the person who found it. Delbert's principle of ground temperature and thermal mass had been in that journal for years before she read it as anything other than a measurement. Luther's father had told him to ask the rock rather than the fire, and Luther had thought him foolish until he stood in her room with his palm flat on limestone, warm enough to outlast a Montana December, and understood that his father had been trying to tell him something he had not yet had the experience to hear. The Chun family had brought the knowledge of northern winters across an ocean and applied it to a Montana hillside in a form that was both entirely their own and entirely consistent with what the stone and the earth and the rising of heat made possible. None of them had invented anything. All of them had understood something. By the following winter, 5 homesteads within 12 miles had some version of underground quarters. By 1891, that number had grown to 14. The term barn quarters entered local vocabulary without anyone particularly deciding to adopt it, the way useful terms always enter a language, because they describe something that already exists and that people need to refer to. What had been called undignified in November of 1887 was called sensible by the winter of 1889 and was called simply how some people did things by 1891. The mockery did not reverse itself in any dramatic way. There was no public acknowledgement, no moment of collective admission. The thing just stopped being strange and became part of the available options, the way all genuinely useful ideas eventually do not, through argument but through results that accumulated quietly season after season until the argument seemed beside the point. Myrtle Whitfield built a small room beneath the Whitfield workshop in the fall of 1889. Carrie learned about it from Winnie, who heard about it from a girl at the settlement school who had heard her mother describe it. Myrtle called it a winter storage room that happened to stay warm. She did not call it anything else, and she did not describe where the idea had come from, and she did not, as far as Carrie ever knew, mention Carrie Braddock's name in connection with it. That was fine. Carrie had not built the room to be acknowledged. She had built it because Etta was coughing and the bedroom was freezing, and she had found a line in Delbert's journal that told her there was heat available below the frost line if she was willing to go get it. Every other thing that had followed the 11 families, the Cravath excavation, the Pritchett root storage, the Chone sleeping platform, the eventual article in the territorial paper, and the pamphlet from the Agricultural Extension Office that got the details partly wrong, but got the principle right, all of that had followed from the same simple sequence. There was a problem. There was a solution. She had applied the solution. The solution had worked. Mrs. Clementine Granger left Montana in April of 1888. She and the Reverend packed their household into 2 wagons and went back to Ohio before the summer came. And Carrie heard later that they had settled in a town near Columbus where the winters were manageable and the houses had proper foundations and the furniture stayed intact from year to year. Before she left, Clementine came to the Braddock property on a Tuesday morning and knocked on the cabin door rather than the barn door, which told Carrie she was not there to see the room. Carrie made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table in the cabin, which was cold in the way the cabin was always cold in April. The chill that the walls held through spring, no matter how the air outside warmed. Clementine said, "I want to apologize for what I said in November, about it being degrading." "It wasn't degrading," Carrie said. "No," Clementine said. "It wasn't." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I'm not built for this kind of cold. I understand that now. You are. I should have understood the difference sooner instead of calling your way of managing it a moral failing." Carrie looked at her. She was a woman who had come from a different place and had expected the world to resemble what she had known, and had found instead that it did not, and that the gap between what she expected and what was true was wider than she was willing to spend her life bridging. That was not a failure of character. That was just an honest accounting of what a person could sustain. "Cold is cold," Carrie said. "You just figure out how to be less cold. That's all anyone's doing it out here." Clementine nodded. She finished her coffee and set the cup down and left, and Carrie watched her wagon go down the county road until it was gone, and then she went back to the morning work. The years that followed were ordinary in the way that good years on a working farm are ordinary, which is to say they were full of difficulty and labor and the particular satisfaction of a life that sustained itself by the work of the people living it. Winnie grew into a young woman with her father's patience and her mother's precision and married a rancher from the next valley over in 1895. Etta became a teacher in Helena, which surprised no one who had watched her spend her childhood winters reading every book she could carry down through the trapdoor. Carrie stayed on the homestead. She used the underground room every winter. She maintained it the way Delbert had maintained his wells, not with sentiment, but with attention, checking the seals and the ventilation and the condition of the limestone at the start of each season, and making whatever adjustments the stone required. The room was never quite the same 2 winters in a row. The earth shifted incrementally with each freeze and thaw cycle. New cracks appeared in the limestone and were packed. A beam showed movement in its notch in the winter of 1892, and she reinforced it with an iron strap she had made herself. The northeast corner seal, which she had repacked 3 times before the Great Storm, and twice since held reliably through the 1890s, and then needed attention again in 1898 after a particularly wet spring. She did not consider any of this to be trouble. It was the nature of a structure built by hand from materials that had their own character and their own response to time. You paid attention and you made adjustments, and the structure continued to do what it had been built to do. That was the whole of it. Old Luther died in the winter of 1891 at the age of 75, in the cabin where he had lived for 30 years, in a bed that was warmer than it should have been, because his son had built a small underground room beneath the adjacent storage shed the previous fall, using a design Otis Cravath had described to him, and Cravath had learned by standing in Carrie's room with a thermometer and asking one question. She attended the burial in March when the ground was workable. She stood at the edge of the gathered neighbors and thought about the afternoon he had come to her barn and put his palm flat on the limestone and said nothing for 2 minutes. She thought about his father who had told him to ask the rock rather than the fire. She thought about how long it sometimes took for the thing someone told you to become a thing you understood. She did not speak at the burial. She was not a woman who spoke at burials. But afterward, walking back to her wagon, she stopped at the edge of the lane and looked at the small mound of turned earth beside the storage shed where Luther's son had dug the excavation the previous summer. The ground above it had been leveled and packed and would not be distinguishable from the surrounding yard in another month. She stood there for a moment, then she went home. Carrie Braddock died in February of 1904 at the age of 51 from influenza. The sickness moved through the valley that winter, the way sickness moves without preference or logic. And she was not the only one it took, though she was the one whose absence was felt most specifically by the families who had learned something from her and by the daughters who had grown up in the warmth she had built. Her obituary in the territorial paper mentioned her homestead, her daughters, her years of contribution to the community. It did not mention the underground room. By 1904, the room was not remarkable. It was just how some people heated their homes in Montana winters. One method among several, the kind of thing that got passed from neighbor to neighbor and modified and improved and eventually became part of the ordinary knowledge of the place. The homestead changed hands 3 times in the years after her death. The barn was rebuilt in the 1920s, the old structure taken down and replaced with something larger and more modern. But the stone room below remained. The new owners used it for storage potatoes, mostly in canned goods, and found it served that purpose well because it stayed cool in summer and did not freeze in winter, which was exactly what a root cellar was supposed to do. Nobody thought much about who had built it or why. In the 1970s, a researcher from the State Historical Society came through the county doing a survey of frontier homestead structures. She found the room during a property assessment and spent an afternoon in it with a notebook measuring and recording. She noted the limestone walls hand-split and carefully fitted. She noted the timber beams notched into the walls rather than resting on ledges. She noted the ventilation shaft still functional, still drawing air in the direction it had been designed to draw it. She noted the blackened mark on the stone floor where a small stove had stood for many years. In her report, she wrote unusual but effective design demonstrating sophisticated understanding of thermal mass and subterranean temperature stability. Origin of design unknown. She was thorough and she looked at everything in the room carefully, and before she left, she ran her hand along the east wall in the careful way of someone checking stonework. Near the northeast corner, at approximately chest height, She felt a slight irregularity in the mortar between two limestone blocks. She pressed, and the block moved slightly outward, revealing a narrow gap behind it. She reached in and felt paper. She withdrew it carefully. It was a folded piece of paper, thin and fragile with age, the kind of paper that had been good quality when new and had become translucent over 80 years. She unfolded it slowly in the lamplight. Most of it was illegible. The ink had faded in the damp, and the years had taken most of the words back. But two lines in the upper portion of the page had been protected by the fold and by the angle of the block, and were still readable in the careful handwriting of a man who had recorded measurements for a living. At 8 feet ground temperature 48 degrees. Below that earth holds steady. The researcher stood in the room for a long time after she read those lines. She was a professional, and she had a report to write and a schedule to keep, and she did not allow herself much time for the kind of reflection that standing in an 80-year-old room with an 80-year-old piece of paper tends to produce. But she allowed herself a moment. Then she folded the paper as carefully as she had unfolded it and placed it back in the gap between the limestone blocks and pressed the block back into place. It was not hers to take. She did not note it in her report. The room was still there. The stone was still warm in the way that stone holds warmth slowly and without any particular regard for whether anyone was paying attention. The ventilation shaft still drew. The northeast corner seal had been repacked sometime in the 1940s by someone who had noticed it was failing and had fixed it, as such things get fixed on working properties without ceremony and without record. The earth below the frost line held its temperature as it had always held it, as it would hold it after the building above was gone, and the county road outside had been repaved twice, and the name Braddock had faded from the memory of anyone in the valley who might have once known it. The earth does not require acknowledgement. It does not require that the people living above it understand what it is doing. It holds because holding is what it does at 8 feet and at 80 years and at any depth below the line where the surface of the world stops mattering. Carrie Braddock had understood that. She had understood it from a line in a dead man's journal, and from the temperature of a barn floor under her boots on a February morning, and from the sound of her daughter coughing in a cold bedroom. She had understood it, and she had acted on it, and she had kept her children warm. That was the whole of it. That was enough.